This short tutorial for academic paper writing discusses the text management of this writing process. I will discuss general principles. I will go over do's and don'ts when it comes to paragraphs, sentences, and vocabulary. Then I'll finish off with some advice for editing. First, in terms of just general principles, you want to plan your text to make it clear, accessible, and convincing. And these three principles might sound very straightforward, but they really aren't. Some things to keep in mind when you are planning your work. Pay attention to your paragraph structure, your sentences, your vocabulary, how they relate to each other. And all these make up part of the text structure. When you write your introduction, I'm going to get back to that in a later video, but just for now, you want to include a clear background. Why are we paying attention to this issue? You want to make it clear to the reader why this issue is important. You need to have a thesis statement and or research questions. You need to have a disposition. This is an outline, a roadmap of the arguments that you are going to present in this paper. And then of course comes the main body text, and then finally comes the conclusion where you revisit and you summarize the presented argument, including your thesis statement and disposition. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to repeat the thesis statement verbatim, but it does mean that you have to reconnect to it in some way. So together then, the conclusion and the introduction, they are the frame of the main body text. Moving on, some things to do when you are working with your text and just trying to produce it, as it were. I have three areas here that I pay attention to: this paragraphs and its sentences and its vocabulary. We'll go over each in turn. First, paragraph. First of all, a proper paragraph divides the page into, the proper paragraph management divides the page into several instances, several times. I've written here about 150 words, or between 100 and 200 words as acceptable for a paragraph. This is not to suggest that any prof that will read your paper is going to sit and count words. It's more as a rule of thumb, so that when you are actually producing your own text, you can have some form of number there to guide you. That doesn't mean that you couldn't write a paragraph of 210 words, of course, you can, but just to give you a sense visually of how long this paragraph should be. If you can see the entire paragraph on your screen when you're working, you're probably on the right track. Now, that's just the space it takes. The structure is really the key for a good paragraph. A paragraph is a unit of thought. It should make one point or one part of a broader point. If it contains too many points, if it contains a lot of points, you want to signal that to the reader. But if it contains more than one thought, it really starts becoming awkward, and you will give the reader the sense that you haven't really organized this in your thought process. And really, if you cleave to this structure, the reader will be able to read your text and read the first and the last line in every paragraph and still get a very good sense for where the gist of your argument. So this is why here I've written that the contents of a paragraph, that each paragraph should contain first line, the topic sentence, which introduces what the paragraph is about. And this is pretty much like in a paper, the thesis statement. This is an equivalent kind of a structure makeup. And then you have the main body text that presents the main argument and the evidence and examples, your value added to the argument, if you will. And then you end this paragraph with the last line, a wrap-up sentence that presents the bottom line of the message and leads into the next paragraph. So this is really what you want to pay attention to when you build your paragraphs. Moving on to sentences. The ideal length here is around 20 words. Again, ballpark figure. Really, nobody's going to count them. It's more to give you a visual tool. Structure, well, now we're getting into grammar. At least subject, verb, object. These should be closely bonded together. You want to have a clearly visible main verb. You want to have qualifiers that are best placed at the beginning or the end of the sentences. The middle of it should be reserved for the core. You want to have qualifiers before or after the subject and verb, objects, and so on. And really, the key, you want to strive for the simplest feasible grammatical construction. That's what you want to do. Just because it's an academic text does not mean that you have to become excessively convoluted, and we'll get back to that when we get to the don'ts. But before that, vocabulary. Here I really want to stress, academic language is not like other forms of writing. It's not like an editorial, it's not like a blog, it's not like prose. You want to convince your audience with evidence. So you want to strive for clarity and scientific accuracy. So avoid hyperbolic things, right? You want to convince your audience with evidence, and part of this is, of course, using academic jargon. Our language, jargon, our professional language, it does specialist things. It has very precise meanings, and they're supposed to be used, these words, precisely when you're aiming for that clarity and scientific accuracy. That's when you use jargon. You use it to increase precision, to really clarify to your reader what this text is about and precisely what you mean. And that way you can avoid ambiguity or value-loaded layman's terms. So this is an example then of a line that's prudent. This evidence suggests that bureaucrats in these circumstances perform less well. I could have written civil servants, really. The point here is that the word suggests means that we're not absolutely sure that these circumstances will always lead to outcomes Y, but we feel fairly confident that there is a correlation and there is some form of effect here that we should pay attention to as scholars and scientists. So suggests then is a really good word to point out that maybe this relationship isn't absolute, but we probably shouldn't ignore it. Moving on to don'ts, and once again I'll go through paragraphs and sentences and vocabulary. Starting with paragraphs. Too long paragraphs are really unorganized and underorganized, and they're really difficult to follow. If your paragraph is going for more than a page, it's too long, simply put. If you write too short paragraphs, that's where your text flow is starting to get interrupted, and you can just integrate them into neighboring paragraphs. Classic mistake here, particularly for too long paragraphs, is when a wrap-up sentence becomes an introduction for the next, an introduction sentence for the next paragraph. And what happens then is that it suggests to the reader that the next paragraph is actually going to talk about exactly the same thing as paragraph 1. So that's a good way, good rule of thumb for you to keep in mind when you're trying to root out this kind of mistake during editing. It's a classic problem. Here's another good idea to avoid. Starting with the name of a referenced author as the first word in a new paragraph implies that the paragraph contains very little of your own value added. You don't really have anything to contribute with here, and you should never signal that. So start with something else. For sentences, avoid those long rambling sentences. They do not necessarily look professional. So keep the sentence under 40 words. Avoid using the passive voice when it comes to the structure of the sentence. This is an example. The car was parked on the bridge by Gloria. It's just a really slow and sluggish sentence, and you could have written the same thing using the active voice instead. Don't start a sentence with a connector, buts and ands and so on. This can work in journalism for flavor, if you will, but it's not going to work in the academia. And don't use contractions in academic text. Vocabulary. I mentioned previously that we are trying to be prudent, that we are using jargon to increase precision, and this is exactly why strong language does not belong in an academic argument. We don't use the words "it is absolutely clear" because there are no deterministic laws in political science, and we're never really sure about absolutely anything in that sense. We should avoid using stereotypes because they are too categorical and too sweeping, and because they just lack precision, and it's just bad science. And do not use jargon when there is no extra value to doing so. It just results in obtuse sentences and not more professional looking text. And when it comes to editing, there is a number of questions you want to ask. I've summarized some good ones here. Is my argument clearly stated in the introduction? Is there a logical flow to the process of argumentation? So when you think about paragraph management, and I'm talking here about which order the paragraphs appear, are they appearing in a logical sequence? Is the first one laying a good foundation, the second one building on that, the third one, and so on and so forth? Really, what you should be able to do here is to make a small note in the margin next to every paragraph as you do your editing, and see a logical point-by-point summary of your argument. The next question, do I provide adequate background and explanation for an informed but not expert audience? You need to keep the audience in the loop all the time, and going into definitions sometimes that are really important for your work, and so on and so forth. You also want to be balanced in the way you treat some other point of view. One thing we don't want to see in the academia is straw manning, as it's known in the internet world. It's when you misrepresent someone else's arguments and then knock them over like a straw man. Don't do that. In fact, your argument will be much stronger if you manage to correctly represent the argument of an opponent and then defeat it. That's going to have much more convincing force. Is your writing clear and concise? Are you writing with a sense of purpose? This is connecting everything logically to your thesis statement, really. Did you summarize your argument and restate your thesis in the conclusion? Have you footnoted everything that you should have? And so finally, when you're working with editing, kill your darlings. Don't be afraid of doing so. In fact, you will probably have to do so sooner or later. Tough decisions have to be made, and they have to be made with two things in mind: the needs of your argument and the needs of your audience. Nothing else should be there. And keep in mind that when you have written the full length of the text, you're only halfway to completing the paper. Editing takes time, and you should plan accordingly. And be open to real revisions, including last-minute revisions of introduction and thesis statement. When we write, our writing itself develops our thought process on the subject matter. So it's not uncommon for us to end up with something quite different from what we had originally planned. But that's okay. All we do then is go back to the introduction, the thesis statement, and adjust that according to what the main body text is actually about. It's a classic neophyte mistake in academic text writing to have an introduction that speaks about something and a main body text that goes off to speak about something else, and that's because we think as we write. So that's again why editing is important, to be able to go back and make those revisions. This was then a short tutorial on how to manage an academic text. Hope you found that useful.